He mocked it. Not policy, not numbers, but the very idea that public schools mattered. He laughed, right there, under the bright lights, in front of millions, when someone mentioned children learning in classrooms with no heat, no books, and no hope. But she didn't raise her voice. She didn't strike back with fury. She simply stepped forward, adjusted the mic, and told a story. A story so raw, so undeniable, it didn't need anger, just truth. And when she finished, he blinked. He looked to the moderator, then to the floor. And for the first time that night, he forgot the cameras were still rolling. This moment didn't come from a movie. It wasn't written for applause. What you're about to witness is a dramatized retelling, fiction woven with emotional truth. Because while the words may be imagined, the silence that followed was all too real. The hearing room on Capitol Hill wasn't built for silence, but that morning it felt like the air was already holding its breath. Rows of suited aides shuffled papers with urgency, not because anything urgent was happening yet, but because the illusion of urgency often fills the space where sincerity doesn't. Cameras were already rolling, 2 fixed, 1 roaming, and another planted on the side, clearly waiting for its star. That star arrived with the sound of flashbulbs and the well-rehearsed murmur of boots and advisors. Trump entered like a performance, every step practiced, every handshake slow enough for a still frame. He waved, nodded, pointed as if acknowledging invisible fans in a stadium only he could see. His red tie was pressed perfectly. His team moved around him like satellites chasing gravity. One camera operator whispered, "Here we go," as if the show had officially begun. What no one noticed, what wasn't supposed to matter, was the woman who had entered 5 minutes earlier through a side door. No entourage, no flashes. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walked in wearing midnight blue and holding nothing but a simple folder. Her heels didn't echo, her entrance didn't interrupt. She took her seat, opened her notes, and simply waited. She wasn't expected to dominate. She wasn't even expected to last. To the media, she was here to participate. To her colleagues, she was decoration, someone to check the diversity box, ask one impassioned question, and politely yield her time. They knew her name, but not her weight. Not yet. The hearing was scheduled to discuss national budget reallocations in public education. The word reallocation had been repeated so many times in early coverage, it had lost its shape, like something chewed by bureaucracy until it had no meaning left. Most expected the usual: statistics disguised as victory, cuts disguised as reform, applause disguised as concern. No one expected anything to shift, especially not because of her. Trump leaned back in his chair like it already belonged to him. His fingers drummed the wood armrest, not out of nerves but rhythm. He thrived in televised environments because he didn't treat them like governance. He treated them like ratings. And in this theater of policy, he believed he had already won the room. AOC said nothing, not yet, but her silence had an edge to it. It wasn't polite, it was strategic, the kind of silence that keeps people guessing, whether it's indifference or preparation. She didn't look at Trump. She looked at the room, the interns too afraid to blink, the committee staffers scrolling their phones under the table, the journalists pretending to be bored, but already adjusting their lens toward the man they thought would carry the show. And it was that expectation, the certainty that the script had already been written, that made the unraveling so much more delicious. Because what no one had noticed was that her folder wasn't a prop. Inside were notes, not from lobbyists, not from consultants, but from janitors, from cafeteria workers, from teachers in rusted trailers who held class beside broken heaters. There was a photo tucked into the back, a school hallway in the South Bronx where the ceiling tiles had collapsed, still unrepaired. She didn't need talking points. She had reality. A staffer 2 rows behind her snorted quietly when her name was called on the docket. That laugh wouldn't last. AOC looked straight ahead, not smug, not smiling, just ready. Because while Trump had entered for the performance, she had entered for the reckoning. And what no one in the room understood yet, what the cameras would eventually capture and social media would immortalize, was that sometimes the most dangerous person in a room isn't the loudest, it's the one who walks in without permission, says nothing, and still manages to rewrite the ending. He started with numbers. He always did. Trump leaned into the microphone with a grin that wasn't meant for the room, but for the replay clips he knew were coming. He rattled off statistics like they were weapons. Graduation rates higher than ever, school choice programs revolutionizing outcomes, federal funding unprecedented. His voice was polished, loud, deliberately confident. He gestured wide as he spoke, as if trying to hold the entire education system in his hands and bend it to his narrative. The committee nodded along, half listening, half waiting for their turn to talk. This wasn't about discovery, it was about dominance. And in the pecking order of Washington performance, no one expected anything to break that rhythm. Certainly not from the woman 3 seats to his left, flipping through notes in a manila folder with no headline-ready statements and no press pool camped outside. The chair recognized her next, almost dismissively. The time was hers, but not the spotlight. AOC didn't adjust the mic. She didn't clear her throat or feign modesty. She just started. She spoke of a school in Mott Haven where the ceiling leaks every spring and the mold on the classroom walls was scrubbed by teachers, not maintenance crews, because there wasn't budget for either. She mentioned a boy named Isaiah who skips lunch every other day to save enough money to buy spiral notebooks by month's end. She didn't name the school. She didn't need to. The room wasn't listening anyway. Most of the lawmakers stared down at their phones. One scrolled through a news feed. Another whispered to an aide. Trump looked amused. He tapped a pen, smirked, leaned over to say something to the committee chair. Loud enough to distract, not loud enough to record. But she kept going. Not louder, just deeper. She described the kind of quiet math that kids in her district learn before they ever touch a calculator. Which weeks to ration asthma inhalers, which teachers will let them take home leftovers from the staff fridge, which days the hallway lights work and which days they don't. She listed statistics too, just not the kind that end up on campaign flyers. Student to counselor ratios that stretch into the hundreds. Chronic absenteeism that isn't laziness, but logistics. SAT scores tanked not by aptitude but by unpaid electricity bills the night before. Still, the room did what it had always done, measured her value by her volume. And since she wasn't raising her voice, they assumed she was just another voice. One more statement for the transcript. One more entry to skim over. Until she stopped. Then she looked up. She didn't glance at Trump. She didn't need to. She looked directly at the chair, at the press table in the back, at the staffers who weren't really listening, and said something no one had prepared rebuttals for. Growth without equity isn't success, she said. It's a shadow on the data. Silence. But not the bored kind. The kind that feels like a room forgetting how to breathe. No gasps, no immediate applause. Just the stillness that comes when a sentence lands too hard to bounce. For the first time since the hearing began, even the scrolling stopped. It wasn't the loudest line of the morning, but it was the one that would survive the sound bites. It wouldn't be quoted in full by the news anchors, but it would be underlined, clipped, and shared in classrooms, teacher lounges, and dinner tables across the country by nightfall. Because it didn't sound like a headline. It sounded like the kind of sentence that makes people rethink everything they thought they understood. And it came from the person they were least prepared to hear it from. She closed her folder. Not dramatically, not for effect. Just the quiet conclusion of someone who had said exactly what needed saying, no more and no less. AOC adjusted her pen, thanked the chair with a polite nod, and turned slightly in her seat to signal she was finished. Nothing about her movement demanded attention. That, of course, was the point. And yet, attention found her anyway. As the next speaker prepared to launch into a pre-approved monologue, there was an unscripted flicker of noise, a breath too audible, a chuckle not meant to be heard. It came from Trump's corner. Not a booming laugh, not a clear insult, just a half-swallowed scoff, coated with the smugness of someone too used to being amplified and too unfamiliar with being overheard. He leaned toward one of his aides, lowered his voice just enough to pretend it was private, and said, "She's polished, sure, but it's all theater." That was supposed to be the end of it. A throwaway line, a whispered dismissal from one performer to another, except the mic was still on. Wired to his lapel, live to the network feed, and fully captured by a room not nearly as inattentive as he thought. In the control booth down the hall, a junior technician froze mid-sip of lukewarm coffee. Her eyes snapped to the waveform bouncing across her monitor. She hit her earpiece. Was that live? Silence on the other end. Then another voice. Confirm audio breach on channel 3. Hot mic confirmed. Within 5 seconds, the control board lit up. A second tech reached to mute the feed. Too late. The audio had already gone public. C-SPAN's live stream carried the comment uncut. Several newsrooms with direct tap-ins had the clip before anyone could redact or spin it. And somewhere in a back office on the 3rd floor, a young intern began screen recording, without even realizing she was making internet history. Inside the hearing room, nothing changed on the surface. No gasps, no accusations. The next speaker continued as if the insult hadn't just landed like a knife between the ribs of dignity, but AOC had paused. Not for long, just for the briefest moment. Enough for her to glance at the mic in front of her, then to the staffers behind the dais. She didn't flinch. She didn't turn to face him. She just let the comment hang there, unacknowledged but undenied. Because sometimes the best answer isn't a rebuttal, it's a spotlight, and Trump had just stepped into his own. Backstage, producers scrambled. Editors were already cutting reels. Social media staffers were clipping captions without needing context. The quote was clean, sharp, and devastating. She's polished, sure, but it's all theater. It was the kind of line that begged to be memed, remixed, and played back in slow motion with subtitles. But what made it dangerous wasn't just the words. It was the moment that followed. Because while Trump had meant to undermine her, he had accidentally revealed something deeper, something viewers over 50 understood too well. The way women in power are dismissed, the way young voices are framed as props, the way calm articulation is mistaken for performance instead of substance, and perhaps most ironically of all, how easily the real theater exposes itself when the actor forgets the mic is still hot. In the minutes that followed, phones lit up like wildfire. Hashtags began bubbling. Editors whispered to anchors. Staffers exchanged glances. But AOC? She just opened her folder again, turned to the next tab, and readied herself. She didn't know it yet, but the line Trump thought would disappear into the air had just done the opposite. It had been recorded, it had been broadcast, and it had ignited something no one could mute. The control room smelled like recycled coffee and rising panic. Producers clustered around a monitor, frozen between instinct and protocol. On screen, Trump's face, smug and unaware. In the air, his voice still echoing. She's polished, sure, but it's all theater. The feed had gone out live, unfiltered, unchecked. The question now wasn't what happened. It was whether to pretend it hadn't. A senior producer barked, "Cut it from the replay, clean and fast. If we bury the audio under B-roll, it'll fade in the noise." Another shook her head. "Too late. Live feed's already up. CNN's running the transcript." In the corner, unnoticed, a college intern sat perfectly still. She didn't speak, didn't blink, just watched the footage back once, then again. Then quietly slid her phone from her pocket, tapped the screen twice, and clipped the 11-second audio into a vertical video with plain white text. Trump, "She's polished, sure, but it's all theater." No tags, no commentary, just the raw sentence and the silence that followed. She hit upload. By the time the producers reached consensus, it was too late. The clip was on TikTok, then Twitter, then Telegram, then Discord. It moved like oil on water, fast, wide, and impossible to contain. Within 20 minutes, the phrase had its own hashtag. #AllTheater. A meme war ignited. One image showed a cracked Capitol stage curtain. Another showed a classroom crumbling behind golden drapes. Commentary spiraled. Polished? Or just not yelling? Funny how women telling the truth is called acting. And still, inside the hearing room, AOC sat calm and unreadable, until a folded slip of paper appeared at the corner of her binder, delivered discreetly by a staffer moving too quickly to make eye contact. She opened it with a glance. He was still mic'd. It aired. Nothing else. Her fingers didn't tremble. Her lips didn't move. but her spine straightened slightly, not in alarm but alignment. Something in the note connected a pattern, a quiet affirmation that this time, the silence wasn't hers to bear. She looked to her left. Trump hadn't noticed. He was scrolling on his phone, nodding along to a staff whispering numbers into his ear. Maybe he thought the room was his again. That control had returned. But outside, the real room had shifted. In a suburban living room in Des Moines, a retired school teacher paused her knitting. "Theater," she muttered, rewinding the clip. In Atlanta, a 19-year-old student shared it in a group chat titled, "Policy over Popularity." In New York, two local journalists compared the clip with an earlier statement Trump had made praising strong female voices, and found the hypocrisy too ripe to ignore. The footage was no longer just content. It had become a symbol of underestimation, of veiled disrespect, of the assumption that poise equals performance and that speaking clearly must mean playing a part. But most of all, it symbolized what happens when the mask slips, not off the speaker, but off the system. Back inside, AOC closed her folder slowly and glanced toward the dais, not at Trump, but at the microphone still glowing faintly red. The nation had heard more than a whisper. It had heard a pattern, and it was only just beginning to listen. The committee room had returned to its usual rhythm, half-listening heads, routine statements, cameras tilting lazily between speakers. Trump leaned back, half grinning as his staff murmured approval, unaware that the real heat wasn't in the room, but online. And then, without announcement or cue, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood up. No raised voice, no accusatory finger, no flourish of retaliation. Just a quiet motion. "Madam Chair, I request a brief procedural point, for the record." The room glanced up, not startled but curious. They expected rebuttal, retaliation, maybe even outrage. They got none of it. What they got was precision. She returned to the microphone the same way she had arrived, composed, direct, unshaken. "I'd like to clarify a comment I made earlier," she began. Her tone didn't rise. Her gaze didn't waver. "When I mentioned growth without equity, I wasn't performing. I was reporting." A few murmurs in the back. One aide fumbled a notepad. Cameras retilted. She continued. "If speaking plainly sounds like performance, maybe we've gone too long confusing showmanship with service." A silence followed, not of confusion, but of discomfort. The kind that settles not when something is said too loudly, but when it's said too clearly to ignore. She didn't mention Trump's name, didn't allude to his hot mic moment. She didn't need to. The quote had already traveled farther than any press release could. That single phrase, "if speaking plainly sounds like performance," landed heavier than any attack. Because it wasn't a jab, it was an X-ray. It exposed the disease behind the insult, a system that praises pageantry, rewards noise, and flinches at truth spoken without makeup or metaphor. One senator shifted in his chair, visibly uncomfortable. Another checked his phone, no doubt already seeing the clip looped online with hashtags multiplying by the hour. But AOC didn't wait for their reactions. She didn't seek permission to validate her own voice. She simply added one final line, spoken not to a man, but to the moment. "Public service shouldn't require an audition." Then she stepped back. No drama, no curtain call, just gravity, dropped like a stone into the still water of the chamber. The moment didn't explode, it echoed. Because what AOC did wasn't merely respond to insult, it reframed the entire room. She shifted the lens from her persona to the institution that judged tone more than truth, delivery more than duty. In that single return, she made the hearing no longer about Trump's comment, but about a question none of them were ready to answer. Who decided that dignity was performative, but arrogance was authentic? The committee chair cleared her throat, clearly unsure how to transition back to line item allocations for charter grants. But the audience wasn't ready to move on, not in the room, not in the country. Because while Trump had exited the conversation with a careless whisper, AOC had re-entered it with something far more disarming, restraint wrapped in revelation. And outside the Capitol, in millions of living rooms and phones and minds, that line kept echoing. "Maybe we've gone too long confusing showmanship with service." It didn't trend like a clapback, and it lingered like a challenge. There was no gavel, no sigh, no quick shift to the next item on the agenda. There was only stillness, the kind that settles when a room realizes it's been seen, not yelled at, not shamed, but seen for exactly what it is. AOC had stepped away from the mic, her seat reclaimed like it had never moved. But the silence she left behind sat larger than any voice could fill. Trump didn't interrupt. Couldn't. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed slightly. Not in outrage, but in recognition. Not fear of the comment, but fear of its precision. Because nothing disarms power like being named. Gently, clearly, without needing to raise a single decibel. One aide reached for a file. Another closed their laptop. The air had changed. But the real shift wasn't happening in the room. It was happening everywhere else. In a Bronx classroom, a public school teacher paused mid-grading, phone in hand, frozen. In a kitchen in rural Ohio, a veteran leaned forward in his chair. On a couch in Florida, a retired librarian whispered, "Play that again." And again it played. The moment, her words, his silence, traveled like current through copper. Because America didn't hear a soundbite. It heard itself. In all its contradiction, its flash, its fatigue, its longing for something real. The clip surfaced online before the hearing had even recessed. At first, just a few hundred views, then thousands, then millions. MOCKED began trending by late afternoon, but the hashtag wasn't about the hot mic anymore. It was about everything that had gone unspoken for too long. The comments section overflowed. Not with rage, but with recognition. A bus driver from Detroit wrote, "Finally someone said it, without shouting, without begging." A single mother in Texas posted, "Not performance, not politics, just truth standing still. No music, no edits, just a 21-second clip where a congresswoman paused a room by speaking like the nation was listening." Even cable networks, typically allergic to stillness, kept replaying the moment. Not because it was dramatic, but because it refused to perform for the drama. Trump didn't storm out. He didn't clap back. He simply sat, as if realizing, perhaps too late, that the insult had boomeranged, and what he dismissed as theater had exposed his own script. And AOC, she didn't gloat, didn't post, didn't respond. She simply left the chamber the same way she came in, alone, composed, and far more powerful than the cameras knew how to frame. The country froze not because something exploded, but because something finally landed. It wasn't a takedown. It was a turning point. And in homes, break rooms, and back seats across America, the phrase began to evolve. MOCKED became a warning, a mirror, a memory, because sometimes the truth doesn't shout. Sometimes it whispers back. It didn't start in Washington. It started in kitchens, in bedrooms, in quiet corners where no blue light blinked, recording, and no aide handed talking points across a polished desk. In Ohio, a retired cafeteria worker sat with her grandchild after school. The volume low, but the silence loud. The clip looped again. AOC standing still, her voice controlled. No pounding, no fire. Just something that sounded too close to home. She typed slowly, fingers stiff but certain. She didn't flinch. That matters more than the numbers. She hit post, then whispered, "That's what I tried to teach them too." Down in Mobile, Alabama, a community college student was finishing a shift wiping down tables. She caught the clip while standing by a broken vending machine. She didn't even know what the hearing was about, but she felt it. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the floor. The tweet went out without hashtags, but the replies came anyway. In Phoenix, a woman recovering from surgery turned up the volume. Her daughter brought soup but ended up putting the tray down just to listen. The clip played. Again. "Who is she?" her mother asked. "Someone they didn't expect to stay standing." And across town, a school principal, 3 decades in the system, leaned on his elbow, eyes locked to the screen. "It's not just what she said," he muttered. "It's that she knew the mic might never come back, and she still used it like it was her last chance." None of them sat on panels. None wore lapel mics. None ran campaigns. But their voices traveled faster than any broadcast package. because something had broken loose. Not a scandal, not a soundbite, but a feeling that maybe dignity still had room in public life, that maybe you could speak without screaming and still shake the walls, that maybe silence wasn't the absence of strength, but the evidence of it. In boardrooms, the moment was debated for spin, but in living rooms, it was remembered, because they knew that kind of silence. They had lived it, holding their breath in parent-teacher meetings, swallowing opinions at town halls, rehearsing one clear sentence they'd never get to finish. And now here it was, someone who finished hers. The clip wasn't reshared for the takedown. It was reshared for the calm after, the clarity, the refusal to let mockery drag her down into the mud. Even cable anchors, the ones who usually spoke over their own guests, paused when they rolled the footage. The script read, "Heated moment," but the footage didn't match. No heat, just light. And AOC, she hadn't tweeted once since that morning. No retweet of the trending hashtag, no selfie, no link to fundraise off the clip. Just silence. And somehow that made it louder. By Friday, a headline in a small-town paper read, "A whisper that traveled further than a shout." And under it, a subheading no consultant could have written better. She didn't come to win. She came to remind us what truth sounds like. The story was no longer hers. It belonged to the people who needed to believe that somewhere in power, someone still remembered them. That's why they watched it again. Not because they forgot what she said, but because it reminded them of what they'd almost stopped hoping to hear. 600 words. The moment hit saturation point. By mid-morning, every political show across cable is looping the footage, but not the full version. Fox runs it with a thick red banner. AOC grandstands again. They cut just before Trump's whisper. One panelist laughs, calls it a scripted feminist stunt. Another smirks. She should thank him. He made her relevant. On CNN, the clip is more polished, but still sanitized. No mention of the mic. No trace of the insult. Just 10 seconds of her final quote. Then cut to panel chatter, a segment titled Optics versus Outcomes. Behind the scenes, producers argue. Some staffers want to air the full thing, but senior editors say no. It's too ambiguous, too open to interpretation. The line between theater and truth is too thin, and it terrifies them. Meanwhile, AOC says nothing. She walks through the Capitol hallways with her phone off. Aide after aide asks if she'll respond. She nods but stays silent. That silence spreads like an ink blot. Then just after 3 p.m., a tweet goes live. No hashtags, no emojis, no press release. Sometimes the truth is quieter than you expect. 16 words, no names, no outrage. But the retweets come like aftershocks. That line makes its way into places the networks missed. Community teachers forward it on WhatsApp. Parents screenshot it in school district forums. A librarian in Michigan prints it out and pins it to a corkboard titled Voices of Now. It's not just the words, it's the restraint, the refusal to shout back. In a media war that thrives on volume, she offered silence, and it roared. Later that evening, a clip resurfaces, not from TV, but from someone's phone recording the live C-SPAN stream. It captures the exact moment Trump leans over to his aide and mutters, "She's polished, sure, but it's all theater." Then silence. Then the tightening of AOC's jaw as she turns away, just before leaving the podium. No camera zoomed in, no music swelled, but the internet hears it for what it was, a dismissal, mid-breath, caught by accident but felt by design. By the time the networks catch up, it's too late. The original narrative has shifted. She never named him, never called for outrage, but the moment grew teeth without her needing to sharpen them. One anchor mutters off-air during a break, unaware of the hot mic. She didn't even fight back, and somehow she still won. And that, perhaps, is the problem. Not that AOC raised her voice, not that she grandstood, but that she didn't need to. That restraint, in a political arena soaked in noise, wasn't weakness. It was weapon. And the nation, somehow, heard it louder than anything else that day. The clip made it to air before the anchors could. No logo, no framing, just his voice. Dismissive, smug, raw. Within minutes, Fox News spun it into a soundbite war. She planned it, they said. A setup. Their lower thirds screamed performance over policy, while hosts leaned in with mock concern. CNN hesitated. MSNBC clipped the clip. They aired her words, but not the silence after. They highlighted her calm, but muted the tremor in the room. The most human moment, the pause, was left on the editing floor. Inside every control booth, a choice had to be made: polish or power. Most chose polish, but online, raw power took over. By dusk, the clip had reached over 3.5 million views across independent accounts. Not even from her official page. And AOC, she posted nothing all day, until midnight. A black screen, white letters. Sometimes the truth is quieter than you expect. No hashtags, no follow-up, just silence. But the comments beneath were deafening. That silence said everything. She didn't play politics. She held a mirror. I came here for outrage. I left with respect. Educators, veterans, single moms, even a former GOP staffer wrote, "For once it didn't feel like theater. It felt like someone remembered we were watching." It wasn't the scandal that made it viral. It was the restraint. And restraint in an age of spectacle is rebellion. By morning, her inbox is a battlefield. Subject lines scream in caps, "Prime time? You're trending." "We want her live tonight." Piers is asking, so is Colbert. Producers scramble to lock her in. CNN wants an exclusive. The Times floats a profile spread. One late-night show even offers to fly her out by private jet. Just for 10 minutes. But AOC doesn't blink, doesn't post, doesn't even reply. Her staff, younger than most of the offers flooding their email, fumbles between fear of missing out and the instinct to protect something more sacred: the story before the spotlight. They ask her once, nervously, "Do we want this moment to go bigger?" She smiles without showing teeth. "It's already bigger than me." Instead of cable lights, she chooses a teachers' union live stream. No commercial breaks, no audience makeup, just grainy video, a modest backdrop, and 3,000 educators logged in from break rooms and kitchen tables. She doesn't try to dazzle. She listens more than she speaks. When she does speak, it isn't about Trump. It isn't even about the mic. It's about the kids in moldy classrooms, about broken air conditioners, about teachers paying for pencils out of pocket while billionaires debate who gets tax breaks. "No soundbite can fix what silence caused," she says once. No one interrupts her. No one needs to. By midnight, the live stream has been replayed over 900,000 times. Not because it shocked, but because it stayed. No filters, no edits, no drama. Just a woman who knew when not to flinch. And somehow, that's what made everyone lean in. 3 days after the hearing, the stadium in Pennsylvania lit up before the sun had even set. Thousands of red hats filled the space like a sea waiting for thunder. Donald Trump took the stage. No intro music, no warm-up. He raised his hand. Applause followed, but it didn't shake the air like it used to. It felt automatic, performed. He stared straight into the camera. His face sharpened, then curled into something smug. "Americans don't want poetry," he said, his voice cutting through the cold mic. "They want action." The crowd responded, sort of. There was noise. But something about it was off. Applause rose, then stalled. A few cheers fizzled before they spread. He went further. "She's not a policymaker," he declared. "She's a dramatist. That's not a congresswoman. That's a performer." More claps, but they came from fewer hands. The energy was trying to swell, but it wasn't catching. He rattled off statistics. Defense budgets, job numbers, immigration figures. Then he brushed past education with a wave of the hand. Nobody's paying attention to that anyway. Every number felt like a brick he was trying to throw at her name. But the more he hurled, the quieter the air became. In the crowd, a middle-aged man wearing a Veterans for Trump shirt lowered his gaze to the floor. A young teacher on the bleachers, once live streaming with her phone raised, had flipped the camera to her own face. Silent. No one said it out loud, but something had shifted. It wasn't just about AOC anymore. It was about how loudly a man could try to erase a voice. A voice people had heard days ago and somehow couldn't unhear. And where was AOC? Not on CNN, not on a podcast, not even quoted in the Times. At 10:08 p.m., a single post appeared on her verified account. If the volume is all you bring, don't be surprised when the room starts listening elsewhere. It didn't shout, it didn't sting, but like a pebble dropped in still water, it rippled. The next morning, an elementary school in St. Louis posted the quote on their front board. A community center in New Mexico used it as the theme for their parents' night. Hashtag #not just noise began to rise. Steadily, then relentlessly. And for the first time, the reaction didn't come from her base. It came from the ones who never noticed her before. Or worse, dismissed her. They didn't call her a hero. They simply said, "At least, she didn't yell." The cameras were rolling again. Not for spectacle this time, but because something had shifted. The world wasn't looking for noise anymore. It was watching for poise. The committee resumed. Trump was absent, but his words from the rally echoed like unfinished business. And then quietly, AOC asked to be recognized. She didn't reference the insult. She didn't pivot to outrage. She began with numbers. $72,000 allocated to restroom maintenance at PS 186, she said, voice even, but zero recorded repairs. One of the aides looked up from his laptop. In that school, she continued, students tracked the flooding schedule of the bathroom. They timed their bladders. One girl was sent home 3 times this year with urinary tract infections. Not for lack of hygiene, but because there was nowhere clean to go. No reaction, just the mechanical whir of air conditioning. Still, she pressed on, not louder, but closer. In another Bronx middle school, 14 kids share 5 social workers, and yet we celebrate this budget as progress, as success. Her finger tapped the folder once, twice. Let's be clear, data divorced from dignity is not governance. It's PR.A man near the end of the table shifted in his seat, his tie slightly too tight for the heat in the room. She paused, not for effect, for breath. I was told that when I speak with clarity, it's called performance. When I name neglect, it's labeled dramatic. Her eyes held the room without accusation, just insistence. But if this is drama, she said, then the script was written in neglect. Not by me, but by decades of budget lines that can find the funds for walls, but not for warmth. That line didn't land. It settled. And then silence. Not awkward, not stunned. Just the kind that knows it's been told something it has no business forgetting. One congressman checked his phone, but didn't type. One aide scribbled, then stopped. AOC closed the folder slowly, not like a slam, more like the closing of a case. She didn't request applause. She didn't look around to see who nodded. She returned to her seat, pen steady again, eyes lowered. And in that moment, the most powerful voice in the room wasn't the loudest. It was the one that refused to perform. Outside, someone watching from a school bus parked for repairs posted a clip of the exchange with the caption, "We don't need more heroes. We just need someone to say it out loud." It wasn't trending, yet. But inside living rooms, the kind with peeling linoleum and kids doing homework on Wi-Fi borrowed from a neighbor, her words had already reached, not because she fought back, but because she stood forward. A mayor from a Midwestern farming town, deep red, proudly traditional, posted something strange on her personal blog that night. She didn't flinch. She didn't shout. She just spoke like she'd seen what others refused to look at. And now, we're all looking. The post had no picture, no hashtags, and still managed to gather 18,000 shares by sunrise. Meanwhile, a late-night radio caller on a conservative AM station in Georgia, voice rough from decades of smoking, said, "I still don't like her politics, but that girl's got guts, and I don't know why, but that matters to me now." That clip traveled faster than most political ads do. Something was shifting, not in policy, not in party, but in posture. Because while the pundits were still arguing about whether she was grandstanding, something quieter was happening. Not on cable, not in donor halls, but in break rooms and dinner tables, in substitute teacher lounges and VFW halls, where conviction isn't measured in volume, but in who keeps showing up. And AOC kept showing up. Not with press junkets, but with proof. She returned to the chamber 2 days later. No preamble, just a single line, spoken with that same sharp calm. Leadership isn't measured by who you can command. It's revealed by who you choose to stand beside. One former state senator, now retired, tweeted, "I never thought I'd say this, but she reminds me of Barbara Jordan." Someone in the replies asked, "Who's Barbara Jordan?" Another replied, "Look her up. Then tell me it's not eerie." The next morning, teachers at a charter school in Phoenix played one of AOC's speeches in homeroom, unplanned, unassigned. One student whispered, "Wait, she didn't even yell. Why did it hit so hard?" A science teacher just nodded and said, "That's what truth does when it's not trying to be loud." Even on talk shows that once mocked her, the tone began to shift, not because they agreed, but because ignoring her was no longer an option. "She makes it hard to look away," said one conservative host begrudgingly. "And honestly, she makes some of us wish we'd paid attention earlier." The movement wasn't meteoric, it was molecular. Not a firework, a fault line. In Los Angeles, a union organizer handed out QR codes at a local bus depot with nothing but the hashtag #, Mike was on in Kansas. A librarian added her remarks to the school's morning newsletter under the quotes to think about section. And in South Carolina, a veteran wrote a letter to the editor. "I served 2 tours overseas. I've heard enough barking orders to last a lifetime. This woman, she doesn't bark. She builds. That's rarer than folks think." Still, AOC didn't lean into it. No press run, no fundraisers branded off the moment. She turned down 5 national interviews. Instead, she live-streamed with a teachers' union in Milwaukee. Not a flashy broadcast. No graphics. Just her in a navy sweater, listening to a para-educator describe how she juggles 42 students and an asthma attack. There were 3,000 people watching live. By the next day, there were 900,000. Not because of outrage, because of recognition. Because something dangerous was happening to cynicism. It was cracking. And in its place, something rare was beginning to grow. Not belief in a party, not belief in a savior. Just belief that someone might actually care. And for a moment, in a country that had grown addicted to spectacle, it wasn't the noise that went viral. It was the stillness. She didn't pull it out like a prop. She unfolded it like a wound. Not in a viral speech, not in front of flashbulbs, just a quiet moment, in a quiet hearing, when the conversation started to slide into numbers again. That's when AOC reached into her folder and pulled out a letter. Yellowed, creased, worn thin at the folds like something read too many times in the dark. She didn't explain. She just read. "Dear Congresswoman, I'm still breathing, but the building isn't. Love, Luis." A pause. Not for effect. For oxygen. Luis was 12. He died waiting for one. Collapsed between third period and a broken nurse's office in a school built before his grandmother was born. Asthma, they said. But the building had been choking longer than he had. No air filters, no working vents, no one assigned to clean the mold above the chalkboard he sat beneath for months. Luis had written her the letter after a Bronx town hall, tucked it into her hand like a secret, and she had kept it. Through bills, through budgets, through battles where no one wanted to talk about children unless they were test scores or headlines. Now she held it like evidence. Luis didn't ask for attention. He asked for air, and we couldn't give him either. The room stayed still, the kind of stillness that happens when guilt gets cornered. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the stakes. "We keep talking about numbers, about line items, but Luis was a line we missed. He fell between the pages you said were balanced." She looked up, not to the cameras, but to the empty seats of those who skipped the hearing. "Every time you defund air purifiers, you're not saving money. You're signing something else." One committee member shifted uncomfortably. Another scribbled, trying not to make eye contact. She continued, "I kept this letter for 2 years, not because I forgot, but because I wasn't ready to admit that we failed him." She folded it back, slowly, precisely, like she was tucking it into something deeper than paper. "If we can name warships after senators, surely we can name a ventilation system after Luis, or at least fix one." No applause, no outburst. Just one cough in the room, Sharp, real, awkward. But outside, the ripple had started. A teacher posted the clip. The building didn't breathe, so neither did he. It didn't trend, it spread. Through staff lounges and school Facebook groups, through parents who once counted inhalers the way others count pencils. One nurse commented, "I've got 600 students, one stethoscope, and 3 ceiling tiles that just fell." A janitor from Philadelphia added, "Tell them to fund the air, or they'll be funding funerals." And somewhere, in a school with plastic taped over its windows, a 7th grader watched the clip on a borrowed Chromebook and whispered, "At least she read it." Because sometimes the bravest thing isn't yelling into a microphone. It's reading a child's whisper out loud and making sure it echoes. No headlines, no hashtags, just a beige subcommittee room where ambition goes to suffocate. One more meeting lost in jargon, one more vote that forgets who it's supposed to remember. But AOC wasn't lost. She came in without cameras, without slogans, just a folder, thick, frayed, and underlined in red ink. She stood slowly, no drama, just gravity. $2.1 billion for infrastructure, 0 for the people inside it. No one blinked, but the silence that followed wasn't passive. It was loaded, like someone had opened a drawer marked inconvenient truths. She flipped pages like she was turning over evidence at a crime scene. Line 14C, millions to repaint gyms. No new school nurses. Line 22A, funds for touchscreen boards, but not for working textbooks. Line 31F, money for metal detectors, but no counselor for the kid walking through it. She didn't yell. She indicted. "We budgeted for chairs, but not for the backs that collapse into them. We built classrooms, but didn't ask if anyone could breathe inside them." The room held its breath. Outside that room, news networks skipped it. Their cameras were elsewhere, on noise, not nuance. But somewhere in Indiana, a cafeteria worker filmed it from a live stream tab open next to her payroll software. She posted it with the caption, "She didn't raise her voice, she raised the floor." It didn't go viral, it went visceral, like a pulse that moved through teachers' lounges, WhatsApp groups of immigrant moms, and retired janitors with cracked knees and sharper memories. One comment, "Our school got new cameras, but the only kid who smiles anymore is the one drawing guns in his notebook." Back in the hearing, AOC never paused for effect. She turned one last page, page 143, $320,000 marked for community engagement materials. She closed the folder. If your definition of engagement is a flyer sent home with a hungry kid, then let me be clear. This budget doesn't miss the mark. It was never aiming. Not a word from the bench, just the shuffling of papers, and something colder, eyes refusing to meet hers. She didn't stay for handshakes. She didn't tweet a clip. She left the room like someone walking out of a burned building, calm, steady, with the smoke still in her hair. But her words stayed. And that's the thing about silence. When it's broken with precision, it doesn't echo. It haunts. The town hall was held in a middle school gym in Scranton. Folding chairs, squeaky floors, lukewarm coffee in styrofoam cups. No lights, no live stream banners, just people. Quiet, curious, a little skeptical. The question came from a man near the back. Flannel shirt, calloused hands, not confrontational, just tired. "Why don't you push harder?" he asked. The room held its breath, waiting for fire. But she didn't give them fire. She gave them friction. "Because shouting feels good," she said, "but showing up, quietly again and again, changes things." No claps, just stillness. She didn't pace the stage. She leaned on the podium like she wasn't trying to convince anyone, just trying to be clear. "I've learned something in these rooms," she said. "You don't move people by out-shouting them. You move them by outlasting what made them stop listening." An older woman, arms crossed tight, blinked once. That was it. But she didn't look away. If volume fixed policy, every protest would have passed a bill by now. Someone near the front lowered their phone, stopped recording. She kept going. Not faster, not louder, just deeper. There's a boy in the Bronx who told me he didn't raise his hand in class because the ceiling leaked right onto his desk, so he stopped believing his voice mattered. That's what this work feels like trying to convince people their voice still counts in a country that keeps letting water drip on their heads. Now the gym wasn't quiet out of politeness. It was quiet like it was absorbing something dense. I've yelled before. It made a splash. But this year I met the janitor who mops up after the splash is gone. He told me, drama dries, damage stays. Someone coughed. The kind of cough that's meant to fill a silence that got too sharp. That's why I come to rooms like this. Not because they trend, because they root. She told them about a budget line that got reversed after a single town hall in Nevada, about a school in Maryland that rehired its nurse because of a letter read aloud. Not at a rally, but during testimony at 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Most change doesn't look like change when it happens. It looks like paperwork, or boredom, or a name that shows up on the attendance sheet again after being gone for months. She paused. You asked why I don't push harder. What if I told you I'm pushing exactly where the door is, even if the cameras are pointing at the wrong wall? That got a reaction. Not applause, but a few heads nodding, slowly. We've been trained to think action has to be loud. That fury equals effectiveness. But sometimes the bravest thing you can do is be consistent when everyone else moves on. She stepped away from the mic, not dropped, not stormed off, just done. The man in flannel gave a half nod. That was all. But as people left, some quietly, some still guarded, no one said it wasn't worth their time. No one asked for their money back. And most importantly, no one forgot what she said. The next day, a clip from that moment was posted, not by her team, but by a local high schooler working sound. Captioned simply, she didn't perform, she showed up. In 48 hours, 3.2 million views. And counting. One comment read, this didn't make me cheer. It made me call my school board. Another, no one clapped, but I stayed. That's new. And a third, she made silence feel like strategy. The story didn't end in that gym, but it started something quieter than applause. And that, she'd argue, is exactly the kind of noise that lasts. It began with a delay, a glitch in a live stream, a few seconds too long before the camera cut. But in those seconds, her mic stayed on, not loud, not performative, just clear. The phrase she hadn't planned to say, but refused to regret. If silence is the system, then speaking softly is rebellion. Within 48 hours, that line was translated into 19 languages. In Madrid, a university professor opened her lecture on civil resistance with the clip. In Nairobi, it played during a community organizing workshop, projected onto a concrete wall beside a food bank. In Seoul, it ran on a subway ad screen. No headline, just the words in black over a still image of her sitting behind the committee desk, eyes down, one hand lightly resting on the folder. The Guardian called it the rise of patient power. Le Monde, l'élégance de la vérité calme. Al Jazeera ran a special segment titled, Not All Revolutions Shout. But back in D.C., AOC didn't hold a press conference, didn't tweet a victory lap. She returned to her desk. Same outfit, same folder, same tone. She didn't weaponize the moment. She walked past it and into the next subcommittee session. That day, she submitted 3 amendments. One on ventilation standards in public housing, one on summer meal access, and one on school nurse retention funding. The news cycle spun. She didn't. Her staff noted a spike in emails, not from donors or reporters, but from librarians, nurses, night shift workers. Subject lines read, "We heard you. Finally, someone who sees us. Thank you for not yelling." Some came with attachments, PDFs of budget gaps, old photos of crumbling schools, personal stories handwritten and scanned like artifacts. One came from a young teacher in Kentucky. They replaced our playground with a turf patch for optics. But when the fire alarm broke, they gave us a whistle. Thank you for naming it. Still, AOC didn't comment on the media wave. She left that to others. The only post she made was a photo, a single hallway, dimly lit, no people, just a handwritten sign taped to a painted wall. Quiet zone. students testing. Her caption, "The best work happens in places nobody claps for." No branding, no logo, but the post reached 4.2 million people. Because it wasn't selling a moment, it was anchoring one. Late that night, in a podcast recorded in a borrowed studio, a former Obama speechwriter said, "We're watching the return of gravity in American politics, and her name is Alexandria." But she didn't respond. She had 3 hearings that week and 2 town halls in districts that hadn't voted blue in years. In one, the mic cut out mid-sentence. She didn't raise her voice. She paused, waited, and finished the sentence without amplification. The room leaned in, and that was enough. Back at her office, a journalist waited for comment. She declined. But as the intern walked the reporter out, they overheard her murmur to a staffer, flipping through notes. "If it's about me, it dies in 48 hours. If it's about them, it lives in policy." That's the line the reporter used for their piece. And that's how a moment, unplanned, unscripted, unpolished, became something more than viral. It became proof that you don't need to raise your volume to raise the stakes. And sometimes the mic doesn't go global because it's loud. It goes global because it stayed on. And so did she. It was the kind of stop that doesn't make headlines. No podium, no stage lights, just a folding table in the back of a public library in Tampa. AOC had flown in on a red-eye. No press crew followed. Her hair wasn't set. The AC buzzed louder than the room. She spoke for 20 minutes. Not about headlines or scandals, but about housing vouchers and how Florida's heat wave was killing seniors who couldn't afford AC. About how funding formulas erased people before census data could name them. About how sometimes silence isn't compliance, it's fatigue. There was no applause break, just quiet nods. Afterward, people came up. A mother with her lease in hand, a nurse with a pink slip, a student who hadn't spoken in the Q&A, but mouthed "thank you" from the second row. And then near the back of the room, someone waited until the line thinned. An older man, sun-spotted hands gripping a rolled Veterans Affairs folder. A Vietnam pin on his cap faded. His voice didn't rise, and it leaned in. "Congresswoman, you reminded me that quiet can still be courageous." She blinked. No sound, just a soft, "Sir?" Like she hadn't expected the words to land so close. "We didn't come back from war knowing how to shout. We just learned to hold steady, and that's what you did in that room last week." He wasn't referring to Tampa. He meant that moment. The mic that stayed on. The line she hadn't intended to deliver, but refused to walk back from. "People think heroism is volume," he added, "but some of us fought to preserve the right to speak soft and still be heard." AOC didn't nod. She didn't pose. Her eyes welled, but it didn't become a photo. No camera caught it. Only her staffer, who'd been taking attendance, paused long enough to quietly step back and let it happen. He handed her a worn envelope. Inside, a copy of a letter he'd written in 1971 to his wife about the sounds he missed most from home, his daughter's pencil scribbling, the hum of a school hallway, the whistle of a kettle before dinner. He said he kept that letter to remind himself what peace sounded like. And that's what your voice sounded like. Not peace as comfort, peace as duty. She didn't cry on cue. She waited until the car ride back to the airport. Then, staring out the window at a street lined with broken bus stops, she quietly whispered, "Quiet can be armor." Her aide didn't ask what she meant, but she wrote it down in her notes app. Because moments like that don't trend, they anchor. Later that week, the story didn't go viral. It wasn't meant to. But a handwritten note from the veteran appeared in the mailroom at the Capitol. No ask, no request, just a single sentence. "You reminded me that not all warriors carry rifles. Some carry receipts." She kept that line. Not for a tweet, not for applause, but for the folder she always carried next to Isaiah's letter and the school budget printouts no one else read. It reminded her, the loudest changes rarely come with hashtags, and sometimes the most radical thing you can do is refuse to raise your voice. Because when the room expects noise, silence can be thunder. And when the crowd wants spectacle, steadiness becomes rebellion. She didn't post about the veteran, she didn't name him, but the next time she was on the House floor, She opened with a line that wasn't part of her prepared remarks. I rise today in defense of quiet courage, the kind that doesn't demand to be seen, only to be felt. No one clapped, but no one left. Because by then, even the critics knew. She wasn't there to win the moment. She was there to make sure it wasn't forgotten. It aired on a Thursday night. Prime time, prime provocation. The host smirked, cueing the line like it was rehearsed. Trump leaned forward, his tone half joke, half accusation. She's dangerous with a mic. That's what happens when you glamorize grievance. Laughter. Applause, light blinking in red. But it didn't quite land the way it used to. The room echoed, but not with power, with performance. The clip hit Twitter within minutes. Memes flew. Headlines bloomed. Commentators dissected it like vultures around something they hoped still had heat. But AOC didn't respond with a thread, or a call-out, or even a camera. Just one line, posted quietly, without punctuation, no emoji, no filter. Grievance isn't what's dangerous, ignoring it is. 7 words. They didn't sting, they unsettled, because they didn't sound defensive. They sounded like a warning. And by morning, it wasn't Trump's clip trending, it was hers. A repost of her budget speech from weeks ago, subtitled by a high school civics teacher who added context line by line like scripture for a new kind of congregation. This is what grievance looks like when it's earned. This is what policy sounds like when you still believe people deserve better. This is what happens when silence refuses to stay silent. Even Fox ran it, framed as strategic emotionality. But the tone had shifted. No one was laughing. In a diner in Ohio, a waitress shared it on her break. I don't like politicians, she said, but this one don't sound like she's acting. In Detroit, a local pastor projected it at the start of Bible study. Sometimes the scripture doesn't come with a verse. Sometimes it comes with receipts. By noon, conservative radio tried again. She's playing the victim, one host said. But a caller, a 62-year-old trucker from Indiana, cut through. Nah, she's not playing the victim. She's saying, stop stepping over the bodies and calling it policy. The station fell silent for a beat, then moved on. Meanwhile, in D.C., AOC didn't gloat, didn't amplify. She walked into a small hearing on housing codes and mold remediation in public buildings. The kind of topic that clears rooms. She stayed. She asked. She named names. Not for show, but for follow-up. And before the day ended, a freshman rep from a rural district slid a note across the aisle. You're getting under his skin. Keep going. But she didn't need the note. The backlash told her everything. They weren't threatened by her volume. They were threatened by her calm, because when she raised her voice, they had a target. But when she didn't, when she just asked, just laid out the data, just drew the line from broken school vents to broken promises, they had no defense. They called her dramatic but couldn't find the lie. They called her angry but couldn't call her wrong. And so Trump tried one more time. This time during a campaign fundraiser. The crowd was older, tighter, more curated. She's got a mouth like a weapon, but no real message. But before the night ended, a leaked video surfaced. Someone had recorded the moment. Not Trump, but the donor next to him. On their phone was a browser tab, still open. AOC's page. The line she'd posted. Still there. Because even in rooms built to silence her, her words were still being read. And that was the thing they never understood. She didn't need to be louder. She just needed to last longer. By the end of the week, she hadn't posted again. But a mural appeared in Queens. A wall painted overnight. No portrait, no slogan, just the quote. Grievance isn't what's dangerous, ignoring it is. Painted in white, across bricks that had seen too many campaigns come and go. The caption below, no hashtags, just a handle. Rep AOC. And in the comments section, say it louder or don't. We're still listening. Because when a voice doesn't rise to meet power, but outlasts it, out-reasons it, out-honors it, that's when the crowd doesn't just clap. They carry the echo. The TV wasn't supposed to be on, but the substitute didn't mind. She was grading quietly in the corner, red pen tapping out slow verdicts on papers that no one would read twice. The sound was low, just a C-SPAN broadcast of a subcommittee hearing most wouldn't remember. But Janiyah noticed. She was 12, sitting in the back row, where no one asks questions and no one gets asked. Her desk wobbled on one leg. The heater groaned in the corner like an old man mumbling in his sleep. Outside, snow smacked the windows in steady, indifferent rhythm. On screen, a woman in a simple blazer leaned toward her mic, not yelling, not pleading, just speaking, calm, measured. Director, AOC. She wasn't pointing fingers. She wasn't pounding the table. But somehow it sounded louder than shouting. Janiyah leaned forward. The woman was talking about school budgets, but it felt like she was talking about her school, about the broken heater, the bathroom stall with no door, the teacher who used to stay after class but left last month and never came back. AOC didn't name the school, didn't name her city, but she named the feeling of being left off the spreadsheet, of being spoken about but never to. Across the classroom, no one else looked up, but Janiyah watched every second. That night back home, her mom was folding laundry when Janiyah whispered. She didn't raise her voice, but I heard her. Her mom paused, a sock half folded in her hand. She looked at her daughter, puzzled. Who? The lady on TV. She was talking about schools, but not like the others. They didn't usually talk politics. Bills came first, then groceries, then the bus schedule. But that night they sat in silence. The good kind. The kind that says, I saw it too. The clip floated around online. Not viral, not loud, but steady, like rain filling a dry well. It showed up in WhatsApp threads, in community Facebook groups, under captions like, this one hit deep. She said it without saying it. I didn't know someone like her was in the room. The next morning, Janiyah printed out a screenshot at school. In the image, AOC was mid-sentence, eyes locked on someone just out of frame. She taped it to her folder, next to a sticker that said, be loud, even if your voice shakes. But AOC hadn't shaken. She hadn't needed to. In civics class that week, the teacher asked what representation meant. Most said, voting. A few said, speaking up. Janiyah said, being the person who says what we live, even if no one claps. The room went quiet, and across the city, a small library put up a display titled Voices That Don't Yell. The staff included one quote, handwritten in marker under AOC's name. They called it drama, but the script was written in neglect. No spotlight, no trending hashtag. But in that classroom, something had shifted. Not everything. The heat still didn't work. The paint still peeled. But a girl had heard something, had felt something, and then said something. That's where change begins. Not with a bang, not with a parade, but with a quiet that doesn't back down. That week, Janiyah wrote her first letter to a council member. She didn't ask for much, just heat that worked and a desk that didn't wobble. But at the end, she added one line. You may not see me, but I'm in the back row, listening. And that's the thing about voices that don't shout. They echo in places microphones don't reach. They teach kids how to speak without rage. They build classrooms where politics becomes personal and personal becomes powerful. AOC didn't know Janiyah's name. She didn't hear the whisper in that Detroit apartment, but her words traveled anyway. And that folder, with the screenshot and the sticker, stayed with Janiyah all year. Because it turns out, you don't have to be loud to lead. You just have to be heard and help others want to listen. She stepped through the old metal doors, not as a student, not as a candidate, not even as a congresswoman, just back to where it began. Morris High hadn't changed much. The paint still chipped along the edges of the lockers. The same hum of fluorescent lights filled the halls. The security guard at the front recognized her instantly, but didn't ask for a photo, just nodded. The announcement over the intercom didn't say celebrity, it said guest speaker. But every hallway seemed to know more than it said. She made her way toward the library, the same one where she'd once sat between cracked encyclopedias and whispered ambition. Now the air was thicker, not with noise, but with meaning. On the wall above the whiteboard, someone had taped up a handwritten sign, black Sharpie, lined paper. Truth doesn't shout, It waits. No name, no decoration, just the words. Quiet, daring, present. AOC stood still, reading it longer than necessary. One of the librarians noticed and said softly, "That was Nina, 10th grade. She said it felt like something you'd say." A pause. "It's better than something I've said," AOC replied. She took the podium. Not a real one, just a rolling cart with a mic clipped to the side. No teleprompter, no fanfare. The students didn't cheer. They didn't need to. Their eyes were locked. That was louder. She didn't talk about Washington, not the hearings, not the headlines, not the fights. She talked about the mornings she'd sat on the steps outside when the building opened late in winter, about the teacher who bought her a MetroCard when hers got declined, about the smell of pencil shavings and overcooked cafeteria fries, about not feeling smart enough until someone made her feel seen. Then her voice dropped. "I come back here, and it's not just memory, it's mission. Because if a school like this taught me how to fight, it also taught me when not to." One student raised a hand. "Do you ever get tired of trying?" She smiled, but not wide. "Only when I think it has to be loud to be real. It doesn't. It just has to be consistent." That line would be quoted on Twitter an hour later, then TikTok, then news tickers. But at that moment, in that library, it just landed. A kid near the window whispered to a friend, "She's like a mic drop without the drop." When the Q&A ended, the students didn't rush for selfies. They lined up quietly, to shake her hand, to say thank you. Some had nothing to say. They just nodded. One girl handed her a folded note that read, "I didn't think people like you remembered schools like this." She did, because she had lived it, not in theory, in echo. Before she left, she asked to stay in the library 5 more minutes alone. The librarian agreed. In the stillness, AOC walked to the back corner where she used to sit during lunch. The same spot, the same chair maybe. She ran her fingers across the edge of the table, now carved with years of names, initials, dreams, and scratches. She didn't post a picture. She didn't go live. She just stood there, remembering not what she learned, but why she learned it. Then she turned back toward the sign. "Truth doesn't shout. It waits," and she whispered under her breath. "It also returns." There was no music when she left the chamber. No cheers, no follow spot. Just the hallway, long, gray, and humming with the kind of silence that follows a storm you didn't see until the debris started falling. Back in her office, the lights were dim. Her team was quiet, not out of defeat, but reverence. One aide finally broke the still. "You want to do a post?" She looked up, almost confused, then calmly said, "Not right now," because she already had. She hadn't interrupted. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't accused, mocked, or ridiculed. She'd simply let someone speak, fully convinced that no one was listening. But someone was. America was. The mic was still on. And so was the country. The clip that went viral wasn't edited. It wasn't soundtracked or cut for impact. It was raw. One continuous feed, no flash. Just truth, unpolished, unscripted, and utterly unmistakable. Some said she trapped him, but those who watched closely knew she didn't trap anyone. He walked in with arrogance and left with echo. In Kansas, a mother paused the video and told her son, "This is what it looks like when you win by listening." In Georgia, a retired judge emailed former clerks, "This isn't style, this is strategy, and it's devastating." In D.C., the usual commentators tried their spins, but the clip outpaced them all, because while pundits were preparing rebuttals, regular people were already replying with their own lives. My daughter said, "She looks like me." That's never happened. I turned the volume up, then realized I didn't need to. I stayed for the whole thing, didn't even check my phone once. Meanwhile, she said nothing. She met with constituents, checked back in with Isaiah's mom about the vents, reviewed the next education grant application, took a call from a teacher in New Mexico. She didn't need to repeat herself. Her silence had already been heard. Later, a respected columnist who'd once dismissed her as too performative wrote something different. Turns out performance isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the act of restraint, of allowing the other side to undress itself, slowly with its own certainty. There was no press release, no thank you tour, just movement. The House received a record number of constituent emails that week, many from independents, even some registered Republicans. A high school civics teacher in Ohio printed the transcript and asked her class to underline, "The moment the room shifted." Half the students picked different lines. That, he said, was the point. Because it wasn't just one moment. It was a buildup, a lesson, a warning, a demonstration. That justice isn't a hammer, it's a mirror. That power unchecked is often undone not by outrage, but by exposure. And that sometimes the most radical thing you can do in a system that profits off chaos is remain calm. Back in her district, someone chalked a message on the sidewalk near her office. The mic stayed on, and so did we. No signature, no logo, just the truth, waiting. Because in an age of performative outrage, she'd chosen persistent grace. In a political landscape saturated with noise, she'd weaponized patience. And when everyone else fought for airtime, she left behind something far more powerful. Silence. That echoes. In a world trained to reward noise, AOC chose clarity. She didn't meet insult with anger. She met it with evidence. Her words weren't sharp for the sake of spectacle. They cut because they were true. It reminds us that real change often comes not through confrontation, but through conviction. When we speak up for those who aren't in the room, especially when it's uncomfortable, we rewrite what leadership means. Have you ever been told your passion was too much when it was actually what the moment needed? Let's stop mistaking calm for weakness. Caption: don't raise your volume, raise your value. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.